Every man deserves peace in his twilight years. Some never get it. Marshal Frank Delaney thought his ghost-chasing days were over when he hung up his badge and settled into a New Mexico homestead. At 62, he'd earned the right to watch sunsets instead of hunting killers. But peace slips away when the past won't stay buried. It started with his donkey, Sadie. She wouldn't drink from the stone well, wouldn't leave it alone. Just stood staring into darkness like listening to whispers. After sleepless nights, Frank lowered a lantern down the well. What he found changed everything. A rusted locket belonging to a woman he'd lost decades ago. How did it get there? And what secrets lay beneath his land? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I got something special for you. The morning sun painted the adobe walls of Frank Delaney's homestead in shades of amber and rust, colors that reminded him why he'd chosen this remote corner of New Mexico territory for his retirement. 5 miles from the nearest neighbor, 20 from the closest town. It was the kind of isolation that let a man hear his own thoughts without the noise of civilization drowning them out. Frank stepped onto his covered porch, coffee mug warming his weathered hands, and breathed in air so clean it made his lungs ache with gratitude. At 62, he'd finally learned to appreciate mornings without urgency, without the weight of a marshal's badge pulling at his chest or the constant awareness of a gun at his hip. The silence was broken by a familiar sound, Sadie's hooves, against the hard-packed earth as she made her way from the small barn to her favorite spot near the old stone well. Frank watched his companion of 15 years, her grey coat silvered with age, her patient brown eyes holding the wisdom that only came from shared hardship. Sadie wore the same worn leather harness she'd carried through 1,000 miles of frontier justice. The leather had darkened with age and sweat, shaped by years of bearing Frank's supplies as they tracked outlaws across territories where civilization was more hope than reality. Every crack in that leather told a story. The deep groove from a bullet that passed too close during the Sandoval gang pursuit. The worn spots where rope had chafed during river crossings. The darkened patches where her own blood had soaked through after an Apache arrow grazed her shoulder. Frank had offered to retire the old harness, to let her spend her remaining years free of any burden. But Sadie seemed lost without its familiar weight. Some habits, Frank understood, became part of who you were. The harness wasn't just equipment, it was identity, purpose, the physical reminder of battles fought and survived together. He'd found Sadie as a yearling, abandoned and half-starved outside Albuquerque. Something in her eyes spoke to him then, a stubborn intelligence that promised loyalty if earned. Frank had been 30 years into his career as a territorial marshal, already carrying more ghosts than any man should. When this scrappy donkey decided to trust him with her life, their partnership began during the pursuit of the Broken Arrow Gang, a group of silver thieves who'd been terrorizing mining operations from Santa Fe to the Colorado border. Sadie proved herself that first week, carrying supplies up mountain trails no horse could manage, standing steady while gunfire echoed through canyons. Never once bolting when other pack animals would have scattered to the wind, Frank set his coffee on the porch railing and walked toward the well, his boots crunching on gravel. 30 years of marshalling had taught him to notice when something was wrong. And for the past 3 days, something had been very wrong with Sadie. She stood at the well's edge, head lowered toward the dark opening, ears forward, in the way that meant she was listening to something Frank couldn't hear. The well had been dry when he bought the property 2 years ago, its stone walls crumbling with age. Frank had never bothered to repair it, relying instead on a newer well he'd dug closer to the house. But Sadie had always been drawn to this spot, often grazing nearby, sometimes resting in its shade during the heat of afternoon. This was different. This was obsession. "Morning, old girl," Frank said softly, approaching the way he'd learned to approach everything in his life, slowly, with respect for what might bite back. Sadie acknowledged him with a gentle snort, but didn't move from her position. Frank ran his hand along her neck, feeling the tension in muscles that should have been relaxed in retirement. Her coat was damp with nervous sweat, and when he looked into her eyes, he saw something that reminded him uncomfortably of witnesses who'd seen things they wished they could forget. Frank had spent 3 decades reading signs. Tracks in dust, fear in faces, lies in testimonies. Animals, he'd learned, were often more honest than people. When Sadie was nervous, there was usually good reason. He knelt beside the well, peering into darkness that seemed to swallow the morning light. The stone walls disappeared into black water 20 feet down, stagnant and still. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would explain why his most sensible companion had suddenly developed an unhealthy interest in an abandoned hole in the ground. "What is it, Sadie? What's got you so worked up?" The donkey's answer was to step closer to the well's edge, close enough that Frank worried she might lose her footing on the crumbling stones. He'd seen her navigate mountain ledges that would challenge a mountain goat, but something about this well seemed to call to her in ways that overrode her usually perfect judgment. Frank's retirement had been everything he'd hoped for. Quiet mornings, simple chores, the satisfaction of work done with his hands instead of his gun. He'd built this life deliberately, choosing isolation over community, silence over conversation, the company of one loyal donkey over the complications of human relationships. The decision to retire hadn't been easy. After 30 years of carrying a badge, Frank had seen enough blood to fill a reservoir, enough betrayal to stock a banker's convention, enough human cruelty to make a preacher question his faith. The final case, a family murdered over a land dispute. 3 children who'd never see another sunrise had broken something in him that couldn't be fixed with whiskey or time. He'd hung up his badge on a Tuesday morning in March, walked out of the territorial capitol building, and kept walking until he found this place. The seller, an aging rancher named Martinez, had been eager to unload property that was too remote for successful ranching, too isolated for anyone with sense, perfect in other words. For a man who'd seen too much of what people did to each other, Frank had spent 2 years creating his sanctuary. He'd repaired the adobe house, adding a covered porch where he could watch storms roll across the vast New Mexico landscape. He'd dug a new well, planted a small garden, built a proper barn for Sadie. Every improvement had been made with his own hands, every decision his own to make. The old stone well had been left untouched, partly from laziness, mostly from sentiment. Something about its weathered stones and patient endurance appealed to him. It had been here before him and would remain long after he was gone, a reminder that some things were built to last. Now, watching Sadie's strange behavior, Frank wondered if leaving the well untouched had been a mistake. He spent the rest of the morning doing his usual chores, feeding Sadie, tending his garden, repairing a section of fence that winter storms had weakened. But throughout the morning, he found himself glancing toward the well, where Sadie maintained her vigil with the dedication of a sentry. By afternoon, when the sun reached its peak and most sensible creatures sought shade, Sadie was still there. She'd shifted position occasionally, moving around the well's perimeter like a surveyor studying a problem from different angles, but she hadn't left for more than a few minutes at a time. Frank brought her water in a bucket, setting it beside her usual feeding spot near the barn. Sadie looked at the water, then back at the well, then at Frank with an expression that seemed almost accusatory. "I'm not the one being unreasonable here," Frank told her. But as the day wore on and Sadie's behavior continued, Frank began to feel the familiar stirring of instincts he'd hoped to leave behind with his badge. Something was wrong. His years as a marshal had taught him to trust that feeling, even when logic suggested otherwise. That evening, as purple shadows stretched across the desert and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Frank made a decision that would change everything. He retrieved a coil of rope from the barn, lit a kerosene lantern, and approached the well where Sadie maintained her faithful watch. "All right, old girl," he said, securing the rope around the well's stone rim. "Let's see what's got you so interested in ancient history." Frank tested the rope's security one final time, wrapping it around his weathered hands. The kerosene lantern cast dancing shadows against the well's ancient stones, its warm light a small comfort against the vast darkness of the New Mexico night. Sadie stood beside him, close enough that he could feel the heat from her body, her breathing steady but alert. "This better be worth the effort, old girl," Frank murmured. Though something in his gut suggested it would be, he lowered the lantern first, watching its golden circle of light descend into the well's depths. The walls were built from carefully fitted stones, probably constructed 60 or 70 years ago, when this land had supported a different kind of life. As the light dropped, Frank could see places where time and weather had loosened the mortar, creating small gaps and crevices in the otherwise solid construction. 20 feet down, the light reflected off dark water. Frank had assumed the well was dry during summer months, but apparently some source still fed it, keeping maybe 3 feet of water in the bottom. The surface was still as a mirror, undisturbed by wind or current. Frank secured the lantern rope and prepared to lower himself. At 62, he wasn't as limber as he'd been during his marshalling days, but years of hard living had kept him stronger than most men half his age. The rope held his weight easily as he began his descent into the well's darkness. The temperature dropped noticeably as he went deeper. Cool, damp air rose from the water below, carrying scents of earth and stone and something else, something that reminded him of old secrets buried too long in dark places. 15 feet down, Frank paused to examine the walls more carefully. His lantern illuminated stones that hadn't seen sunlight in decades, their surfaces slick with moisture and age. Most of the gaps between stones held nothing but accumulated debris, dead insects, bits of wind-blown vegetation, the detritus of time passing. But in one crevice, about 18 inches above the waterline, Frank's light caught the glint of something that didn't belong. He maneuvered closer, balancing against the opposite wall while reaching toward the object. His fingers closed around something small and metallic, something that had been deliberately wedged into the gap between two large foundation stones. Frank's heart began beating faster as he lifted the object into the lantern light. It was a locket, silver tarnished black with age, its delicate chain tangled and brittle. The surface was pitted with rust and corrosion, but the basic shape was unmistakable, a heart-shaped piece of jewelry that had once been someone's treasured possession. With careful fingers, Frank pried open the locket's clasp. Inside, protected by the silver casing, was a small photograph, faded but still recognizable. A woman's face looked back at him across 25 years of time and memory, her dark eyes full of life and promise and trust that had been betrayed. Elena Vasquez. Frank's hands began to shake, and for a moment he thought he might lose his grip on the rope. Elena Vasquez, who had owned the cantina in Silver Creek. Elena Vasquez, who had vanished one October morning in 1868 without a trace, leaving behind only rumors and speculation, and one heartbroken marshal who'd never stopped believing that something terrible had happened to her. Elena Vasquez, who had worn this locket every day Frank had known her, touching it absently when she was nervous, twisting its chain around her finger when she laughed. Elena, who had removed it only once in Frank's presence, the night she'd opened it to show him the photograph inside. "It's my mother," she'd said, sitting beside him on the cantina's back porch, sharing a bottle of wine under stars that seemed close enough to touch. "She died when I was 16. I wear this to remember that love doesn't end just because someone goes away." Frank closed the locket and held it against his chest, feeling emotions he'd buried for decades, rising like floodwater after a spring thaw. Elena had been more than just another case, more than another missing person whose fate would remain forever unknown. She had been the woman who might have changed his life, the possibility he'd never quite forgotten. The road not taken that haunted quiet moments. He'd been 43 then, already worn down by years of chasing violent men across violent territories. Elena had been 32, beautiful and intelligent and kind, running her late husband's cantina with grace and determination. Their relationship had been brief but intense. 3 months of stolen moments between Frank's duties. 3 months of hope for a different kind of future. Then she was gone. Frank had investigated her disappearance with the dedication of a man whose personal and professional lives had become impossibly tangled. He'd interviewed everyone in Silver Creek, searched every building, followed every trail that led out of town. The official conclusion had been that Elena ran away, possibly with a traveling gambler who'd been in town the week before she disappeared. Frank had never believed it. Elena wasn't the kind of woman who ran from problems, and she'd been too rooted in Silver Creek, too committed to the life she'd built there. More importantly, she'd been afraid of something in the weeks before she vanished, afraid enough to ask Frank to stay close, to walk her home after dark, to check the cantina's locks twice before leaving her alone. He'd failed to protect her then. Now, holding her locket in the depths of a well on his own property, Frank realized he might finally have the chance to learn the truth about what had happened to Elena Vasquez. But how had her locket ended up here, in a well 20 miles from Silver Creek, on land that Frank had bought 2 years ago from a rancher who'd owned it for decades? The timing made no sense. The location made no sense. Nothing about this discovery made sense except for one terrible possibility. Elena hadn't run away. Elena hadn't disappeared voluntarily. Elena had been murdered, and someone had hidden evidence of that murder in this well, either because they owned the land or because they knew it was remote enough that the evidence would never be found. Frank looked up toward the circle of starlight that marked the well's opening. Sadie's silhouette was visible against the night sky, her patient vigil finally explained. Somehow, in the mysterious way that animals sometimes knew things humans couldn't understand, she'd sensed that this well held more than water. The climb back to the surface felt endless. Frank's muscles ached, and his breathing was labored by the time he hauled himself over the well's stone rim, but the locket remained clutched safely in his fist. Sadie nudged him gently as he sat on the ground catching his breath, her liquid eyes reflecting understanding. "You knew, didn't you?" Frank asked her. "You knew she was down there." Frank stood slowly, his joints protesting the night's exertion. He held the locket up to the lantern light, studying every detail as if it might reveal secrets beyond Elena's photograph. The chain was broken in 2 places, suggesting it had been torn from her neck rather than removed willingly. The locket itself bore small dents and scratches that hadn't been there when Elena wore it, signs of violence, signs of struggle. Signs that Elena Vasquez hadn't simply walked away from her life in Silver Creek. Frank closed his eyes and tried to recall everything he'd known about Elena's disappearance. The official investigation had been handled by his partner at the time, Marshal Jim Cortez, while Frank was tracking cattle thieves in the Northern Territories. By the time Frank returned, the case had been closed, and the official verdict was that Elena had chosen to disappear. Jim had been dismissive of Frank's concerns, impatient with his partner's emotional investment in the case. "She was a cantina woman, Frank," Jim had said. "They come and go. That's their nature." But Frank had known Elena better than that. She wasn't a drifter or a woman who made impulsive decisions. She'd built a life in Silver Creek, had friends and responsibilities and roots that ran deep. Her disappearance had been as out of character as it was sudden. Now, 25 years later, Frank held evidence that his instincts had been correct. Elena hadn't left voluntarily. She'd been taken, murdered, and buried somewhere that her body would never be found. Someone had kept her locket as a trophy, or thrown it in this well to dispose of evidence. The question was who, and why had the locket ended up on property that Frank now owned? Frank walked slowly back to the house, Sadie following at his side. In the kitchen, he lit an oil lamp and examined the locket more carefully. The photograph of Elena's mother was water-damaged, but still recognizable. On the back of the locket, barely visible beneath years of tarnish, were the initials EV engraved in elegant script, Elena Vasquez. No doubt remained about the locket's identity. Frank made coffee and sat at his kitchen table, the locket resting in front of him like evidence in a trial that would never come. Outside, the desert night was quiet except for the distant call of coyotes and the whisper of wind through sagebrush. Normal sounds of a normal night in a place where nothing extraordinary was supposed to happen. But something extraordinary had happened here. Something connected to a case that had haunted Frank for 25 years. Elena Vasquez had been murdered, and somehow her killer was connected to this land, this well. This quiet corner of New Mexico that Frank had chosen for his peaceful retirement. Peace, it seemed, was no longer an option. The past had found him, rising from the depths of an old well like water from a buried spring. Frank Delaney might have retired his marshal's badge, but Marshal Delaney had never stopped seeking justice for the innocent dead. Tomorrow, he would begin asking questions that should have been asked 25 years ago. Tonight, he would plan an investigation that might finally give Elena Vasquez the justice she deserved. The locket caught the lamplight as Frank closed his fingers around it, holding tight to the first real clue in a mystery that had shaped more of his life than he'd ever admitted. Elena was gone, had been gone for decades, but her story wasn't over. Not yet. Frank sat at his kitchen table until dawn, the silver locket resting in his palm like a piece of his own heart excavated from the earth. In the lamplight, Elena's mother gazed up at him from the faded photograph, her eyes holding the same gentle strength that had drawn Frank to Elena all those years ago. Every detail of the locket brought back memories he'd spent decades trying to forget. The delicate engraving around the edges, worn smooth by Elena's fingers. The small dent near the clasp where she'd dropped it once, laughing at her own clumsiness as Frank helped her search for it in the cantina's sawdust-covered floor. The way the silver had caught candlelight during their evening conversations, drawing his attention to the graceful curve of her neck. Frank's hands trembled as he opened and closed the locket, each movement releasing another flood of memory. Elena had touched this same clasp hundreds of times, had wound this same chain around her finger when she was thinking, had pressed it against her lips when she worried. He'd first seen her on a Tuesday afternoon in June, 1868. Frank had been tracking a horse thief through Silver Creek when thirst and the need for information led him to the cantina at the town's dusty heart. The building was nothing special. Adobe walls, rough-hewn wooden tables, a bar made from planks stretched across whiskey barrels. What made it extraordinary was the woman behind the bar. Elena Vasquez moved with quiet confidence, serving drinks and meals with equal grace, managing rowdy customers with firm words and a smile that could gentle the meanest drunk. She was beautiful in the way that desert sunsets were beautiful, not flashy or obvious, but something that grew more striking the longer you looked. Frank had ordered whiskey and asked about the horse thief, but found himself lingering long after his questions were answered. Elena had humor to go with her beauty, intelligence to match her kindness. When she laughed at his story about chasing a suspected cattle rustler, who turned out to be a Methodist preacher leading his congregation's livestock to new grazing, Frank felt something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with the whiskey. Their courtship unfolded over 3 months of Frank's returns to Silver Creek. He'd find reasons to pass through town, official business that somehow always required a stop at Elena's cantina. She'd serve him dinner and listen to his stories, sharing her own tales of the characters who passed through her establishment. Gradually, their conversations moved from the cantina to evening walks through Silver Creek's quiet streets, then to the back porch where they'd sit under stars and talk about everything except the fact that they were falling in love. Elena had been widowed young, married at 17 to a man 20 years older who died of fever after 3 years. She'd inherited the cantina and transformed it from a rough drinking establishment into a place where families felt welcome, where travelers found not just food and drink, but genuine hospitality. "My husband saw this place as a business," she'd told Frank one evening, her fingers absently stroking the locket at her throat. "I see it as home for people who don't have one." Frank had been ready to propose. He'd even picked out a ring during a supply run to Santa Fe, a simple gold band that he'd carried in his vest pocket for 2 weeks, waiting for the right moment to offer Elena a different kind of life. Then everything changed. The shift began in late September. Elena became nervous, distracted, jumping at shadows that Frank couldn't see. She'd ask him to check the cantina's locks twice, to walk her home even when darkness was still hours away. When Frank asked what was wrong, she'd only say that someone had been watching her, asking questions about her late husband's business dealings. Miguel never did anything wrong, she'd insisted, her hands worrying the locket chain. He ran this cantina honestly, paid his debts, helped his neighbors. But someone thinks he left something behind, something valuable. Frank had investigated as best he could, but found no evidence of threats or suspicious strangers. The people of Silver Creek spoke only good of Elena and her late husband. If someone was watching her, they were skilled enough to avoid a marshal's notice. Frank's biggest regret, the mistake that haunted him more than any failure of law enforcement, was that he hadn't taken Elena's fears seriously enough. He'd seen her nervousness as feminine imagination, her concerns as the natural anxiety of a woman living alone. His own arrogance and assumptions had blinded him to real danger the last time. Frank saw Elena alive was October 12, 1868. He'd been called away on urgent business, reports of Apache raids in the northern territories that turned out to be false alarms, generated by nervous settlers. Elena had walked him to his horse, her hands clutching his arms with desperate strength. "Promise me you'll come back soon," she'd said, her dark eyes wide with fear. "Promise me, Frank." 2 weeks, he'd assured her, kissing her forehead. "Maybe less if this business resolves quickly." Elena had nodded, but her grip on his arms hadn't loosened. "If something happens to me, nothing's going to happen to you," Frank had interrupted, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who'd spent years believing he could protect the people he cared about. "Silver Creek is a safe town. You have friends here. 2 weeks, Elena. Then we'll talk about our future." She'd released him then, stepping back with the smile that had first captured his attention. But the smile didn't reach her eyes, and Frank left Silver Creek with an uneasiness he couldn't explain and didn't trust enough to act upon. When Frank returned 3 weeks later, Elena was gone. Her friend Maria Santos, who helped with cooking and cleaning at the cantina, told a story that never felt right to Frank. Elena had left before dawn on October 15th, taking only a small bag of belongings and leaving a note saying she'd decided to start fresh somewhere else. The cantina had been left to Maria, along with instructions to sell it and keep the proceeds. The note was in Elena's handwriting, but something about it felt wrong to Frank. Elena wrote with careful penmanship, her letters precise and elegant. The note was rushed, sloppy, the words of someone writing under pressure or duress. More troubling was Elena's abandoned locket. Maria claimed Elena had left it behind deliberately, saying she wanted to start her new life free of old memories. But Frank knew how much the locket meant to Elena, how often she touched it when speaking of her mother. She would never have abandoned it willingly. Frank's partner, Jim Cortez, had been dismissive of these concerns. "Women change their minds, Frank. She got tired of waiting for you to propose and found someone who wouldn't keep her hanging on hope." But Frank knew Eleanor better than that.
She wasn't impulsive or deceptive.
If she'd wanted to end their relationship, she would have told him directly. If she'd found someone else, she would have been honest about it. Elena didn't run from problems. She faced them with the same quiet strength that had made her successful as a businesswoman in a man's world. The official investigation lasted exactly 1 day. Jim interviewed Maria, read the note, declared the case closed. Elena Vasquez had chosen to disappear. Case closed. No crime committed. Frank had continued his own investigation for months, following leads that went nowhere, asking questions that had no answers. He'd tracked the mysterious gambler who'd been in town the week before Elena disappeared, eventually finding him in Tucson with solid alibis and no connection to Elena beyond buying drinks at her cantina. He'd searched every trail leading out of Silver Creek, looking for signs that Elena had left on foot or horseback. He'd telegraphed law enforcement in every major town within 100 miles, describing Elena and asking them to watch for a woman matching her description. Nothing. Elena Vasquez had vanished as completely as if she'd never existed. Now, 25 years later, Frank held the evidence that his instincts had been correct. Elena hadn't chosen to disappear. Someone had taken her, murdered her, and disposed of the evidence in ways that would keep the truth hidden for decades. The locket was more than jewelry. It was proof that Elena had died violently, that her killer had kept a trophy, or tried to dispose of evidence in a place where it would never be found. The broken chain suggested she'd fought, that the locket had been torn from her neck during whatever final struggle had ended her life. Frank closed the locket and held it against his chest, feeling the weight of 25 years of grief and guilt and unresolved love. He'd failed Elena once by not taking her fears seriously enough. He wouldn't fail her again. Somewhere out there, a murderer had lived free for decades, believing their crime would never be discovered. They were wrong. Elena Vasquez would finally have justice, even if Frank had to spend whatever years remained to him to see it done. Frank saddled his horse at first light, the locket secured in his vest pocket, where he could feel its weight against his heart. Sadie watched from beside the well. Her vigil finally ended, her purpose served. She'd led him to Elena's truth. Now it was his responsibility to follow that truth wherever it led. The ride to Silver Creek took 4 hours across terrain that hadn't changed much in 25 years. The same red mesas rose from desert floor. The same scattered junipers provided meager shade. The same vast sky stretched endlessly overhead. But Frank felt different making this journey. No longer the confident marshal who'd ridden these trails in pursuit of justice. Now, an aging man seeking answers to questions that might be better left unasked. Silver Creek had declined in the years since Eleanor's disappearance. What had once been a thriving community of 200 souls had shrunk to perhaps half that number. The silver mines that had given the town its name played out a decade ago, taking most of the population with them. Buildings stood empty, their windows boarded up, their adobe walls crumbling back to the earth from which they'd been shaped. Elena's cantina sat at what had once been Silver Creek's bustling heart, but was now just a wide spot in a dust-blown street. The building remained intact but abandoned, its windows covered with weathered boards, its wooden sign long since fallen and carried away by desert winds. Frank tied his horse to the hitching post that Elena had used to secure delivery wagons, and stood for a moment looking at the place where he'd first fallen in love. The back porch, where they'd shared wine and dreams, was still there, sagging with age but recognizable. The front door, where Elena had welcomed travelers and locals alike, stood slightly ajar, revealing darkness beyond. "Frank Delaney, is that really you?" Frank turned to see Maria Santos approaching from a small adobe house across the street. She'd aged as he had, her black hair now streaked with silver, her face lined with years and weather and worry. But her eyes were the same warm brown he remembered, and her smile still carried genuine warmth. "Hello, Maria. It's good to see you." She embraced him with the easy affection of shared history, then stepped back to study his face. "You look well for a man who's supposed to be retired. What brings you back to Silver Creek after all these years?" Frank hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. Maria had been Eleanor's closest friend, the one person who might have known Eleanor's secrets. But Maria had also been the source of the story about Elena's voluntary disappearance, the witness whose testimony had closed the case. "I've been thinking about Elena lately," Frank said carefully. "About what really happened to her." Maria's expression shifted, warmth replaced by something Frank couldn't quite read. "Elena left Frank, you know that. She made her choice and started over somewhere else." "Did she?" Frank pulled the locket from his pocket, watching Maria's face as recognition dawned. "Then how did this end up at the bottom of a well 20 miles from here?" Maria went pale, her hands reaching instinctively toward the locket before stopping short. "Where did you find that?" "On my property, hidden in a place where it was never supposed to be found." Frank held the locket in his palm, letting Maria see Elena's mother's photograph. "The chain is broken, Maria, torn off, not removed gently. This isn't the locket of a woman who chose to disappear." Maria looked around nervously, as if checking to see who might be watching or listening. "Come inside," she said finally. "There are things I should have told you years ago." Maria's house was small but comfortable, decorated with the religious icons and family photographs that marked it as a place where people lived rather than merely existed. She poured coffee from a pot that had been warming on her wood stove, her hands shaking slightly as she set the cups on her kitchen table. "I lied to you," she said without preamble. "I lied to everyone about Elena leaving voluntarily. She didn't write that note, Frank. Someone else did. Someone who copied her handwriting well enough to fool people who didn't know her as well as I did." Frank felt anger rising in his chest, anger that had been building for 25 years. "Why? Why did you lie about something so important?" "Because I was afraid." Maria's voice was barely above a whisper. "Because Elena was killed for seeing something she shouldn't have seen, and I was afraid I'd be next if I told the truth." "What did she see?" Maria stood and walked to a window that looked out on Silver Creek's empty main street. 3 nights before she disappeared, Elena couldn't sleep. She went out to the cantina's back porch to get some air, maybe to think about you and whether she should wait for you to propose or find the courage to propose herself. Frank's chest tightened at this detail. Another reminder of opportunities lost to time and circumstance. "She saw them meeting behind the cantina," Maria continued. 4 men, talking quietly, looking around like they didn't want to be seen. "One of them was your partner, Marshal Jim Cortez." Frank's coffee cup slipped from his fingers, shattering on the kitchen floor.
"Jim, you sure?"
Elena knew all the lawmen who came through Silver Creek. She was certain it was Marshal Cortez. The other 3 were strangers, but they had the look of men who lived by violence. Elena watched them for maybe 10 minutes, trying to understand what lawmen would need to discuss in secret behind a cantina in the middle of the night. What did she hear? "Talk about silver shipments. Routes and timing, which guards could be trusted and which couldn't. Planning, Frank, planning for robbery." Frank's mind raced through implications and connections. Jim Cortez had been his partner for 8 years, a man he'd trusted with his life on dozens of occasions. Jim had drinking problems and gambling debts, but Frank had never suspected him of corruption serious enough to involve armed robbery. "Elena came to me the next morning," Maria continued. "She was terrified but determined to do the right thing. She was going to wait for you to return and tell you what she'd seen, let you handle it through proper channels. But someone knew she'd witnessed the meeting. The next day, a man came to the cantina asking questions about Elena's late husband, Miguel. Specifically, he wanted to know if Miguel had left any records of his business dealings, any papers that might be valuable. Elena told him no, but she knew he wasn't really asking about Miguel. Maria returned to the table and sat heavily, her face etched with 25 years of guilt and fear. Elena was smart, Frank. She understood that the questions were really about what she might have seen or heard. Someone was testing her, trying to determine if she was a threat. What happened the night she disappeared? "I don't know." "Elena was supposed to meet me for breakfast the morning of October 15th, but she never came. When I went to check on her, the cantina was empty. There was a note on the bar in her handwriting, saying she'd decided to leave Silver Creek and start over somewhere else. But you knew she didn't write it. Elena would never have left without saying goodbye to me, never. And she would never have left her mother's locket behind. That locket was the most precious thing she owned." Maria reached across the table and touched the locket gently. "When I saw it was gone, I knew the note was false. But by then, Marshal Cortez had already investigated and closed the case. He said Elena had run off with a traveling gambler. Case closed." Frank stood and paced to the window, his mind working through the timeline and implications. Jim had been alone in Silver Creek while Frank was chasing false reports of Apache raids. Jim had controlled the investigation into Elena's disappearance. Jim had dismissed Frank's concerns and refused to reopen the case. Jim had been part of the conspiracy that killed Elena. "There's something else," Maria said. "After Elena disappeared, I found this hidden in the cantina. She went to an old wooden chest and retrieved a folded paper, yellowed with age. It was stuck behind a loose board near the back door. Like Elena had hidden it there for safekeeping. Frank unfolded the paper and found himself looking at a wanted poster dated 1867, The Broken Arrow Gang. He read aloud. Wanted for armed robbery of silver shipments and murder. The poster showed crude sketches of 4 men, their faces familiar in the way that violent faces became familiar to lawmen who'd spent years studying criminal descriptions. At the bottom was a reward offer, $500 for information leading to the arrest of gang members. I remember this gang, Frank said slowly. We tracked them for months, in 67 and 68. Never caught them, but we suspected they had inside information about silver shipments. Someone was feeding them details about routes and timing. Elena must have recognized one of the men from the meeting, Maria said. That's why she kept the poster, why she was so afraid. Frank studied the sketches more carefully, trying to match them with his memories of the gang. The Broken Arrow Gang had been unusually successful because they seemed to know exactly when and where to strike. They'd rob a shipment and disappear before any pursuit could be organized, always staying one step ahead of law enforcement. Now Frank understood why. Jim Cortez had been feeding them information, using his access to territorial marshal communications to provide details about silver shipments and patrol schedules. The gang had been successful because they'd had a lawman as a partner, and Elena had witnessed a meeting between Jim and gang members. Had seen evidence of the corruption that was getting miners and guards killed in the name of easy money. Maria, Frank said quietly, I need you to think carefully. In the days before Elena disappeared, did you see any strangers in town? Anyone who might have been watching the cantina or asking questions about Elena? There was one man. He came through town 2 days before Elena vanished, asking about accommodations and supplies. But he spent more time watching the cantina than he did in the general store. Elena noticed him too. She mentioned that she felt like she was being watched. Frank folded the wanted poster and put it in his pocket alongside Elena's locket. 25 years after her murder, he finally had the beginning of the truth. Elena had witnessed evidence of corruption involving his own partner. She'd been killed to protect that secret, and Jim Cortez had used his position as investigating marshal to cover up the murder. Thank you for telling me the truth. Maria, I know it wasn't easy. What will you do now? Frank looked out at Silver Creek's empty streets, at the abandoned buildings and broken dreams that marked the passage of time in places where hope ran dry. I'm going to find out what happened to the men who killed Elena, and I'm going to make sure they finally pay for what they did. Maria nodded, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. Elena deserved better than the life she got, Frank. She deserved better than the death she got. I'm glad someone finally cares enough to seek justice for her. Frank mounted his horse for the ride back to his homestead, his mind already working through the investigation that would consume whatever years remained to him. The Broken Arrow Gang might be dead or scattered, but someone was still alive who knew the truth about Elena's murder, and Frank Delaney intended to find them. The ride back to his homestead gave Frank hours to process Maria's revelations, but the truth felt like swallowing broken glass. Jim Cortez, his partner for 8 years, the man who'd saved Frank's life during the Sandoval gang shootout, the man who'd stood by Frank through some of the darkest cases in territorial law enforcement, had been corrupt enough to get Elena killed. Memories of their partnership took on sinister new meanings as Frank rode through the desert afternoon. Jim's occasional unexplained wealth, the new boots or expensive whiskey he'd claimed to have won in poker games, his detailed knowledge of silver shipment schedules that had seemed like professional thoroughness, his dismissive attitude toward Elena's disappearance, his eagerness to close the case and move on to other business, signs that Frank should have recognized but had missed because trust, once given, was hard to withdraw. Sadie was waiting by the well when Frank returned, as if she'd been standing vigil in his absence. She She approached as he dismounted, nuzzling his shoulder with the gentle insistence of an animal who sensed emotional turmoil in her human companion. "You were right, old girl," Frank murmured, stroking her neck. "There was something in that well worth finding, but I suspect we're not done digging yet." Frank spent the rest of the afternoon walking his property with new eyes, looking for anything that might be connected to Elena's murder. If her locket had been hidden in the well, what else might be buried on land that he'd assumed was simply a peaceful retirement retreat? The property consisted of 40 acres of high desert, most of it suitable only for grazing or solitude. Frank's house and barn occupied maybe 2 acres near the center, with the old stone well positioned between the main buildings and a small shed that had come with the property. Frank had used the shed for storing tools and equipment, but now he wondered about its history. The shed was older than the house, built from the same weathered adobe and rough timber that suggested construction in the 1840s or 1850s. Frank had never paid much attention to its details, but now he examined it with the methodical attention he'd once brought to crime scenes. The earth around the shed's foundation showed subtle signs of disturbance. Areas where the soil was slightly looser, where vegetation grew differently, where the natural desert hardpan had been broken and imperfectly restored. Someone had been digging here, and recently enough that the signs were still visible to trained eyes. Frank retrieved a shovel from the barn and began systematic excavation around the shed's north wall, where the soil seemed most disturbed. 3 feet down, his shovel struck something that rang with metallic resonance. Frank dropped to his knees and used his hands to carefully clear dirt from around the object. A cloth-wrapped bundle emerged from the earth, heavy and roughly cylindrical. Frank lifted it carefully, feeling the unmistakable shape of a revolver beneath the deteriorated fabric. With trembling fingers, he unwrapped the bundle on the shed's wooden floor. Jim Cortez's service revolver lay before him, its blued steel pitted with rust, but still recognizable. Every territorial marshal's weapon was registered and recorded, its serial numbers and distinctive marks noted in official records. Frank didn't need to check the serial number to know this was Jim's gun. He'd seen it drawn and fired hundreds of times over their 8-year partnership. The revolver's cylinder held 5 spent cartridges and 1 live round, suggesting it had been fired recently before being buried. Frank examined the weapon carefully, looking for any clues about when it had last been used and why it had been hidden on property he now owned. More disturbing was the implication that Jim had been on this property, that he'd buried his service weapon here for reasons Frank was only beginning to understand. The gun hadn't been here when Frank bought the land 2 years ago. The disturbed earth was too fresh, the burial too recent. Frank sat back on his heels, pieces of a terrible puzzle beginning to fit together in his mind. Jim had retired from marshalling service 10 years ago, citing health problems and a desire to return to his family in Colorado. But what if Jim hadn't gone to Colorado? What if he'd remained in New Mexico, living quietly, perhaps on this very property? The previous owner, Martinez, had been eager to sell and reluctant to discuss the property's history. He'd claimed to have owned it for 30 years, but had lived there only intermittently, using it mainly for seasonal cattle grazing. What if Martinez had been lying? What if Jim had been living here, using Martinez as a front to hide his presence in the territory? Frank examined the shed more carefully, looking for signs of recent habitation. In one corner, he found the remains of a bedroll and some canned goods, their labels faded but readable. Coffee, beans, hardtack, the basic supplies of a man living simply and temporarily. The dates on the labels were recent, within the past 2 years. Someone had been using this shed as a shelter, someone who'd wanted to remain hidden from official notice, someone who'd buried a marshal's service revolver in the same ground where Eleanor's locket had been, hidden in the well. Frank's investigation was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats approaching from the south. He quickly rewrapped Jim's revolver and hid it in the barn, then walked out to greet his visitor with the casual demeanor of a man whose afternoon had involved nothing more suspicious than routine property maintenance. The rider was Miguel Santos, Maria's nephew and Frank's nearest neighbor. Miguel was a man of 50, weathered by decades of ranch work, but still strong and capable. He'd been helpful since Frank moved to the area, offering advice about desert living and assistance with the heavier work of establishing a homestead. "Good afternoon, Frank. I saw you riding back from Silver Creek earlier and thought I'd check if everything was all right. You looked troubled. Just revisiting old memories, Miguel. Sometimes that can be harder than chasing outlaws." Miguel dismounted and accepted Frank's offer of coffee, settling onto the porch with the easy familiarity of a friend. "My Aunt Maria mentioned you'd been asking questions about the old days, about Elena Vasquez." Frank studied Miguel's face, wondering how much Maria had shared with her family about their conversation. "Elena was important to me once. I've always wondered what really happened to her. Maria says you believe Elena was murdered. I have reason to think so." Frank decided to trust Miguel with part of the truth. "I found something that belonged to Elena, something that suggests she didn't leave Silver Creek voluntarily." Miguel nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "There are stories about this property, Frank, stories the previous owner didn't share when he sold it to you." "What kind of stories?" "Martinez claimed he'd owned this land for 30 years, but people remember differently. They remembered him living in town most of that time, only coming out here occasionally. Some folks thought he might be hiding something or someone." Frank felt his pulse quicken. What did people think he was hiding? There were rumors about strangers living on the property from time to time. Men who didn't want to be seen in town, who kept to themselves and paid Martinez to keep quiet about their presence. The kind of men who might have reasons to avoid lawmen. Did anyone ever see these men? "My cousin Pedro worked cattle for Martinez sometimes. He mentioned seeing lights in the shed at night, times when Martinez claimed no one was staying there. Pedro thought maybe Martinez was involved in smuggling, helping people cross the territory without official notice." Frank absorbed this information, understanding now why Martinez had been so eager to sell and so reluctant to discuss the property's history. The land hadn't been a simple ranch. It had been a hideout, a place where men on the run could disappear from official scrutiny. "Miguel, did Pedro ever describe any of these mysterious guests?" "One time, maybe 5 years ago, Pedro saw a man who looked like he'd been a lawman. Older fellow, graying hair, the kind of bearing that comes from years of authority. The man was careful not to be seen, but Pedro got a good look at him from a distance. Jim Cortez." Frank was certain of it. Jim had been using this property as a refuge, paying Martinez for the privilege of living in hiding. But hiding from what? And why had he buried his service revolver in the same ground where Helena's locket had been concealed? Frank thanked Miguel for the information and saw him off, then returned to the shed with new urgency. If Jim had been living here, there might be other evidence of his presence. Other clues to help Frank understand the connection between his former partner and Elena's murder. In the shed's dim interior, Frank began a more systematic search. Behind a loose board in the wall, he found a small metal box containing papers and personal items. Most were routine, receipts, letters, the ordinary detritus of a man's life. But at the bottom of the box was something that made Frank's blood run cold. A photograph of Elena, taken without her knowledge from across the street from her cantina. She was sweeping the front steps, unaware that someone was watching her, documenting her daily routines. On the back of the photograph, in Jim's familiar handwriting, were the words, "Problem solved, October 1868. Frank stared at the photograph until his hands began shaking. Jim hadn't just been involved in the conspiracy that killed Elena. He'd been the one who'd carried out her murder. He'd stalked her, planned her death, and kept a photograph as a trophy of his crime. The man Frank had trusted with his life. The partner who'd shared 8 years of dangerous work and close friendship. Had murdered the woman Frank loved and then helped cover up the crime through his official authority as investigating marshal. Frank walked out of the shed and stood in the fading desert light, Elena's locket in one hand and Jim's photograph in the other. 2 pieces of evidence spanning 25 years. 2 proofs that justice delayed was not justice denied. Jim Cortez might think he'd escaped consequences for Elena's murder, but Frank Delaney had other plans. Tomorrow, he would begin the hunt for a killer who'd hidden behind a badge, who'd betrayed every principle of law enforcement, who'd taken the life of an innocent woman to protect his own. Corruption. The hunt would end only when Elena finally had the justice she deserved. Frank spent 2 days preparing for a journey that would take him farther from his homestead than he'd traveled since retirement. The evidence he'd discovered demanded answers that could only be found by tracing Jim Cortez's path from corrupt Marshall to Elena's killer, a trail that led first to Santa Fe and then to Colorado. Before leaving, Frank made careful arrangements for Sadie's care with Miguel Santos, who promised to check on the property daily and maintain the animal's routines. Sadie seemed to sense the significance of this departure, following Frank around the homestead with unusual attention, as if understanding that this journey was different from his previous investigations. "I'll be back." "Old girl," Frank assured her, scratching behind her ears the way she'd always enjoyed. "But I need to finish what you started when you led me to that well." The train from Albuquerque to Santa Fe carried Frank through country he'd once patrolled as a territorial marshal. But now he traveled as a private citizen, seeking justice for private wounds. The rhythm of wheels on rails gave him time to organize his approach, to plan questions and anticipate the obstacles he'd face in pursuing a 25-year-old crime. Santa Fe's Territorial Records Office occupied a stone building near the plaza, its files containing the official history of every lawman who'd served in New Mexico territory. Frank identified himself to the clerk as a retired marshal researching a cold case, which was true enough to avoid uncomfortable questions about his authority. Jim Cortez's personnel file made for disturbing reading. His service record showed steady advancement through the ranks, commendations for bravery, successful completion of difficult assignments. Nothing in the official record suggested the corruption that Frank now knew had characterized Jim's final years of service. But the financial records told a different story. Jim's pension had been processed normally until 5 years ago, when payments had stopped due to the recipient's death. The address on file was Trinidad, Colorado, where Jim's widow reportedly still lived. More interesting were the communication records. The file contained copies of official telegrams sent and received by Jim during his years of service. Most were routine, reports to superiors, coordination with other law enforcement agencies, requests for assistance or information. But Frank found several telegrams from Jim's final months of service that seemed unusual. The messages were addressed to various mining operations and silver transportation companies, ostensibly asking about security arrangements and shipment schedules. Perfectly legitimate communications for a territorial marshal, except that Frank recognized some of the dates as corresponding to successful robberies by the Broken Arrow gang. Frank copied the relevant documents and took the afternoon train to Denver, then caught a connecting line to Trinidad. The journey gave him more time to consider the implications of what he'd learned. Jim had been using his official position to gather intelligence for the gang's robberies, probably earning a percentage of their take in exchange for inside information. Elena had witnessed a meeting between Jim and gang members, had recognized the corruption that was getting innocent people killed. Her murder had been necessary to protect not just Jim's criminal activities, but his official reputation and his freedom. Trinidad, Colorado was a mining town that had seen better days, its prosperity tied to coal deposits that were playing out just as Silver Creek silver had played out years earlier. Frank found Jim's widow, Catherine Cortez, living in a small frame house on the town's edge. Her existence supported by a combination of Jim's pension and work as a seamstress. Catherine was a woman in her 60s, gray-haired and worn by hardship, but still possessing the dignity that came from facing life's difficulties without complaint. She welcomed Frank with the hospitality that frontier women extended to travelers, offering coffee and conversation even before learning the purpose of his visit. "You were Jim's partner," she said after Frank introduced himself. "He spoke of you often, especially in his final years. He said you were the best lawman he'd ever known. The most honest. Frank felt guilt twist in his stomach at this description, knowing what he'd come to ask and how it would shatter Catherine's memories of her husband. Jim was a good partner for many years, ma'am. But I've recently learned some things about his activities that trouble me greatly. Catherine's expression shifted, warmth replaced by wariness. What kind of things? I believe Jim may have been involved in criminal activities during his final years as a marshal. They believe he may have been connected to the murder of a woman named Elena Vasquez. Catherine set down her coffee cup with shaking hands. I was afraid someone would come asking questions someday. Jim was never the same after he retired. The guilt ate at him like a cancer, drove him to drink more than any man should, took years off his life. What did he tell you? Everything. Near the end, when the whiskey and the guilt had destroyed his health, Jim confessed to things I wished I'd never heard. He told me about taking money from outlaws, about providing information that got people killed. He told me about the woman in Silver Creek. Frank leaned forward, his heart racing. What did he say about Elena? Catherine stood and walked to a window that looked out on Trinidad's quiet streets. Jim said he'd gotten involved with a gang of silver thieves, that they were paying him for information about shipments and patrol routes. Good money, more than a marshal's salary could provide. But the woman at the cantina in Silver Creek saw the meeting, recognized Jim as a lawman, so he killed her. Jim said it wasn't supposed to happen that way. The gang wanted to scare her into keeping quiet, maybe pay her to leave town. But when they went to talk to her, she fought back. She threatened to expose the whole operation, said she'd rather die than let them continue killing innocent guards and drivers. Frank closed his eyes, imagining Eleanor's final moments, her courage in the face of certain death. She died defending principles that Jim had abandoned for money. Jim said she was braver than any of them expected, Catherine continued, tears now flowing freely. She died fighting, died protecting other people who would never know her name. That's what haunted Jim most, that he'd killed someone better than himself. What did he do with her body? There's an old mine shaft about 30 miles north of Silver Creek, deep enough that nothing thrown down there would ever be found. Jim said that's where they put her, where she'd stay hidden until Judgment Day. Frank absorbed this information, finally understanding Elena's fate. She hadn't just been murdered. She'd been denied even the dignity of a proper burial, thrown into a hole in the ground like refuse. Catherine, I need to ask you something that might be difficult. Did Jim keep any papers from those days, any letters or telegrams that might provide evidence of his involvement with the gang? Catherine hesitated, then walked to an old trunk in the bedroom. Jim made me promise to burn these after he died, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Part of me hoped someday someone would come asking questions, someone who could make sure the truth was told. She returned with a bundle of papers tied with string, telegraph messages, letters, and handwritten notes that documented Jim's criminal activities in painful detail. Frank spread them on Catherine's kitchen table, reading communications that confirmed everything he'd suspected, and worse. The telegrams showed detailed coordination between Jim and gang members, sharing information about silver shipments, guard assignments, and patrol schedules. The handwriting was Jim's, the official telegraph letterhead, authentic. No doubt remained about Jim's guilt or the scope of his betrayal. One message, dated 3 days before Elena's disappearance, was particularly damning. Cantina woman is a problem. She knows too much. Will handle personally. Make sure no traces remain. Another sent the day after Elena's murder. Problem eliminated. Official investigation will show voluntary disappearance. Case closed. Frank gathered the papers carefully, knowing they represented not just evidence of Jim's crimes, but the final proof Elena needed for her vindication. 25 years after her murder, the truth could finally be told. What will you do with this information? Catherine asked. I'm going to make sure Elena Vasquez gets the justice she deserves, even if it means destroying Jim's reputation posthumously. She died protecting innocent people. Her story deserves to be told. Catherine nodded, fresh tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. Jim died 5 years ago, but he never really lived after he killed that woman. The guilt consumed him, turned him into someone I barely recognized. Maybe having the truth told will finally let both their souls rest in peace. Frank took the evening train back to New Mexico, Jim's telegraph messages safely stored in his traveling bag. He now had documentary evidence of the conspiracy that had killed Elena, proof that would satisfy any court or investigative body. But Frank's investigation wasn't complete. The telegraph messages mentioned other gang members, men who might still be alive, men who could provide additional testimony about Elena's murder. More importantly, Frank needed to find Elena's body, to give her the proper burial that had been denied for 25 years. The hunt for Elena's killers was far from over. But Frank finally had the tools he needed to see justice done. Elena Vasquez would not remain a forgotten victim. Her murder hidden by corruption and covered up by a badge that had been dishonored by the man who wore it. Justice delayed was not justice denied. And Frank Delaney intended to prove that truth could survive even a quarter-century of lies. Frank returned to his homestead with Jim's telegraph messages and Catherine's revelations burning in his mind. But something about the story felt incomplete. Catherine had spoken of Elena's body being thrown into an old mine shaft, yet Elena's locket had been found in his well. Why would Jim keep a trophy from his victim but dispose of the body elsewhere? The inconsistency nagged at Frank as he reunited with Sadie, who seemed to sense his continued agitation despite the answers he'd found in Colorado. She led him immediately to the well, standing at its edge with the same intense focus she'd shown before his first discovery. "What is it, old girl? What else is down there?" Frank had examined the well thoroughly during his initial investigation, but he'd been looking for evidence of Elena's murder, not questioning whether she might have died at all. Now, armed with knowledge of Jim's guilt, but troubled by contradictions in Catherine's account, Frank decided to explore the well's depths more systematically. He lowered himself into the well with proper equipment this time, multiple lanterns, rope, and tools for excavation. The stone walls held secrets beyond Elena's locket, and Frank intended to discover them all. Working methodically, Frank examined every crevice and gap in the well's construction. Most held nothing but debris and mineral deposits, but in a deep crack behind a protruding stone, Frank's fingers encountered something that shouldn't have been there. Oiled leather, wrapped around what felt like a book or journal. Frank worked the package free carefully, his hands shaking with anticipation. The leather wrapping had protected its contents from 25 years of moisture and decay. Inside was a small leather-bound journal, its pages filled with Elena's distinctive handwriting. Frank climbed from the well and sat beside it in the afternoon sun, Elena's diary open on his lap. The first entries were dated September 1868, just weeks before her supposed disappearance. Frank began reading Elena's own words about the events that had shaped both their lives. September 20th, 1868, Frank has been called away on urgent business. Apache raids that may or may not be real. I worry about him constantly, but I also worry about what I witnessed 3 nights ago. The meeting behind the cantina was not innocent conversation between lawmen and informants. Marshal Cortez was planning something terrible with those men, something that will get innocent people killed. I recognized one of the other men from a wanted poster Frank showed me months ago. The Broken Arrow Gang. They're not just planning another robbery, they're planning to eliminate anyone who might expose their corruption. September 25th, 1868A. Stranger came to the cantina today asking about Miguel's business records, but I could see in his eyes that he was really asking about me, about what I might have seen or heard. The questions were a test, and I think I failed it. Maria noticed the man too. She's afraid, and she should be. We're both in danger now, but I won't run away. If something happens to me, I want Frank to know the truth about who killed me and why. Frank paused in his reading, struck by Elena's courage, even in the face of mortal danger. She'd known she was marked for death, but had chosen to stay and fight rather than flee to safety. October 10th, 1868, I've made a terrible discovery. The corruption goes deeper than I imagined. Marshal Cortez isn't just taking bribes from the Broken Arrow Gang. He's their inside source, their partner in every robbery they've committed. The silver shipment robberies, the murdered guards, the terrorized mining communities. Jim Cortez shares responsibility for all of it. But I've also made a wonderful discovery. I'm carrying Frank's child. Frank's vision blurred as he read these words, grief and joy and loss crashing over him like a flash flood through a dry riverbed. Elena had been pregnant when she disappeared, carrying his child, carrying their future. The life they might have built together had been growing inside her, even as danger closed around them both. October 12th, 1868, Frank left this morning for the Apache business, and I wanted to tell him about the baby, but couldn't find the courage. When he returns, we'll talk about our future, about marriage and children, and the life we want to build together, but I don't think I'll live to see Frank return. The man who visited the cantina came back last night, along with 2 others. They didn't come inside, just watched from across the street for an hour, testing my routine, learning my habits. When they come for me, it won't be to talk. October 14th, 1868, tomorrow they'll come for me. I can feel it the way animals feel approaching storms. But I won't make it easy for them, and I won't let them silence the truth. I've made arrangements. Frank turned the page with trembling hands, desperate to understand what Elena meant by arrangements. Rosa Martinez has agreed to help me disappear. She runs a network of women who help other women escape from dangerous situations, abusive husbands, vindictive employers, men who believe they own the women in their lives. Rosa says she can give me a new identity, a new life in California where no one will think to look for Elena Vasquez. The plan is simple but dangerous. Rosa will provide a body, a young woman who died of fever last week, whose family can't afford proper burial. We'll dress her in my clothes, leave her in a place where she'll be found after I'm supposed to have left town. The body will be too decomposed for identification, but the clothing will be enough to convince people that Elena Vasquez is dead. Meanwhile, I'll travel to California as Rosa's cousin, starting over with nothing but hope and the child growing inside me. Frank stared at the journal entry, his understanding of the past 25 years collapsing and reforming around this impossible revelation. Elena hadn't been murdered. She'd faked her own death and escaped to California, where she'd been living under a new identity for more than 2 decades. The Elena Vasquez who'd loved Frank Delaney had died in 1868, but the woman herself had survived. She'd given birth to their child somewhere in California, had built a new life far from the corruption and violence that had threatened her in New Mexico. I'm leaving this diary in the well where Frank and I used to meet for private conversations. If something goes wrong with my escape, if someone discovers the truth about my disappearance, maybe someday Frank will find these words and understand why I had to leave without saying goodbye. I love him more than life itself, which is why I can't risk his life by involving him in my escape. If he knew about the baby, he'd try to protect us both and probably get himself killed in the process. Better that he grieve for Elena Vasquez and live to find happiness with someone else than die trying to save a woman who's already found a way to save herself. October 15th, 1868 tonight. Rosa and I will switch Elena Vasquez for her body double, and tomorrow Elena Vasquez will be officially dead. The woman who survives will be Rosa Martinez, and she'll live free of the violence that ended Elena's life. If Frank ever reads this, I want him to know that leaving him was the hardest thing I've ever done. I want him to know about our child, about the love that survives even when the lovers must part. I want him to know that somewhere in California, a woman who once loved him is living the life he made possible by teaching her to be brave. Someday, when enough time has passed and the danger is gone, maybe I'll find a way to contact him. Maybe we can meet again as different people with different names, in a place where the past can't touch us. Until then, I'll carry his love in my heart and our child in my arms. Rosa Martinez. Frank closed the diary and sat in stunned silence, his understanding of the past quarter-century completely transformed. Elena was alive. She'd been alive all these years, living in California under the name Rosa Martinez. raising their child who would now be 24 years old. The grief that had shadowed Frank's life for 25 years had been based on a lie, but it was a lie told from love. Elena had sacrificed their life together to protect them both, had endured the pain of separation to ensure their survival. But the revelation also brought new understanding of recent events. Jim Cortez's confession to his wife had been accurate in its emotional truth, but wrong in its details. Jim had planned Elena's murder, had been prepared to kill her, but Elena had outmaneuvered him through her own courage and the help of women who understood the dangers facing their gender in a violent world. The photograph Frank had found in Jim's possession, the one showing Elena sweeping the cantina steps with "problem solved" written on the back, represented Jim's mistaken belief that his plan had succeeded. He'd found the body Rosa had provided, had assumed it was Elena, and had spent the rest of his life carrying guilt for a murder he'd intended but failed to complete. Frank stood and walked to where Sadie waited patiently beside the well. The old donkey had led him to Elena's locket, had insisted on showing him the well's secrets. Somehow, in the mysterious way that animals sometimes knew things that defied human understanding, Sadie had sensed that the well contained not evidence of death, but proof of life. "She's alive, old girl," Frank whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "After all these years, Elena's alive." Frank returned to his house and spread out Elena's diary alongside the documents he'd gathered about Jim's criminal activities. The evidence painted a complete picture now: corruption and conspiracy, planned murder and miraculous escape, love surviving across decades and continents. But most importantly, the diary contained Elena's new identity and her intended destination. Rosa Martinez, living somewhere in California, probably in one of the communities where women could disappear into new lives and new possibilities. Frank had spent 25 years grieving for a lost love, but Elena Vasquez, now Rosa Martinez, had spent those same years building the life they might have shared together. She'd raised their child, had probably married again, had created the happiness that circumstances had denied them both in New Mexico. The question now was whether Frank had the right to disturb that carefully constructed new life, whether his need for reunion was worth the disruption it might cause to Elena's hard-won peace. But first, he needed to find her. After 25 years of believing Elena was dead, Frank Delaney had discovered that the love of his life was alive and waiting for him to be smart enough to realize where she'd gone. The hunt was no longer for Elena's killer, but for Elena herself. And Frank intended to find her, no matter how long it took or how far he had to travel. The story wasn't over. In fact, Frank realized it was just beginning. Frank spent 3 sleepless nights wrestling with the decision that would define whatever years remained to him. Elena was alive, living as Rosa Martinez somewhere in California, but 25 years had passed since their separation. She'd built a life without him, had raised their child, had probably found love and happiness with someone else. Did he have the right to disrupt that carefully constructed peace? The answer came as he sat beside the well where Elena had hidden her diary, watching Sadie graze in the morning light. Elena had written that she hoped they might meet again someday as different people, with different names, in a place where the past can't touch us. She'd left the door open to reunion, had trusted him to be wise enough to find her when the time was right. 25 years felt like long enough to wait. Frank began preparing for the most important journey of his life with the methodical care he'd once brought to pursuing dangerous criminals. This was a different kind of hunt, but it required the same attention to detail, the same willingness to follow leads wherever they led. He arranged for Miguel Santos to manage the homestead during his absence, unsure how long he'd be gone or whether he'd return at all. If Elena welcomed him back into her life, Frank was prepared to stay in California. If she'd moved beyond their shared past, he'd respect her choice and return to New Mexico with the peace that came from knowing she was safe and happy. Sadie seemed to understand the significance of these preparations. following Frank around the property with unusual attention. When Frank knelt beside her to explain his departure, she nuzzled his shoulder with gentle insistence, as if offering encouragement for the difficult path ahead. "You did good work." "Old girl," Frank told her, stroking her neck. "You led me to the truth when I'd given up looking for it. Now I need to see where that truth takes me." The train ticket to San Francisco felt weightier than paper and ink had any right to feel, representing as it did Frank's leap of faith into an unknown future. He'd purchased a one-way ticket, committed to following Elena's trail wherever it led, rather than planning a quick visit and return to familiar territory. The journey to California took 4 days, carrying Frank through landscapes that changed from New Mexico's high desert to Colorado's mountains to California's coastal valleys. Each mile increased his nervousness and anticipation, bringing him closer to a reunion that might heal 25 years of wounds or create entirely new ones. Frank used the travel time to plan his search strategy. Elena's diary mentioned Rosa Martinez, but provided no specific location within California's vast territory. She'd spoken of communities where women could start over, places that offered anonymity and acceptance to those fleeing difficult pasts. San Francisco seemed the most likely destination. The city's rapid growth and diverse population provided exactly the kind of anonymity Elena would have needed to establish a new identity. Its large immigrant communities offered places where a woman with a Spanish surname could blend into established neighborhoods without attracting unwanted attention. Frank's train pulled into San Francisco's bustling station on a foggy October morning that reminded him uncomfortably of the weather on the day Elena had supposedly disappeared. The city overwhelmed him immediately. More people in one place than he'd seen since his marshalling days. Noise and activity that made his quiet homestead seem like another world entirely. He found lodging in a modest hotel near the Mission District, reasoning that Eleanor would have gravitated toward areas where Spanish was commonly spoken, and Catholic families provided social networks for newcomers. Frank's plan was methodical: visit churches, schools, and businesses where a woman named Rosa Martinez might have established connections over the past 25 years. The search proved more difficult than Frank had anticipated. California's Mexican and Spanish populations were extensive, and Martinez was a common surname. Every lead seemed to generate 3 more possibilities. Every promising connection faded under closer examination. Frank spent 2 weeks following false trails, interviewing helpful clerks and suspicious landlords, searching records and asking questions that sometimes generated more confusion than clarity. His Spanish was rusty but functional, learned during years of law enforcement in territories where English and Spanish mixed freely in daily conversation. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Frank was eating dinner at a small restaurant in the Mission District when he overheard 2 women discussing someone named Rosa, who ran a boarding house for women in difficult circumstances. The description matched Elena's journal entries about the network of women who helped other women escape dangerous situations. Frank approached the women carefully, explaining that he was looking for a Rosa Martinez who might be involved in helping displaced women. One of the women studied him suspiciously before providing directions to a boarding house on Dolores Street. The address led Frank to a well-maintained 3-story building in a neighborhood that balanced respectability with affordability. A discreet sign identified it as Casa Rosa, rooms for ladies, and Frank could see women of various ages coming and going with the purposeful activity of people who'd found safe harbor after difficult journeys. Frank positioned himself across the street, watching the boarding house with the patience he'd learned during decades of surveillance work. If Elena was inside that building, he wanted to approach her carefully, without creating disruption or embarrassment for the life she'd built. On his second day of observation, Frank saw her. She emerged from the boarding house's front door carrying a market basket, moving with the same graceful efficiency he remembered from her cantina days. 25 years had silvered her hair and lined her face, But Elena Vasquez, now Rosa Martinez, remained unmistakably the woman he'd loved and lost, and somehow found again. Frank's heart hammered against his ribs as he watched Elena walk toward the local market, her bearing confident and purposeful. She'd not just survived the past quarter-century, she'd thrived, had built exactly the kind of life that suited her generous nature and practical intelligence. But Frank's reunion fantasies were interrupted by the appearance of three men who'd been watching the boarding house from a different vantage point. They followed Elena at a discreet distance, their attention focused and professional in ways that triggered every alarm from Frank's law enforcement experience. Frank recognized the type immediately. Hired muscle, probably from out of state, men whose presence in Elena's neighborhood represented serious danger. Their clothes and bearing suggested they weren't local street criminals, but professional enforcers. The kind of men who traveled long distances to settle old scores. Frank followed the men who were following Elena, his martial instincts fully engaged despite his civilian status. Elena completed her shopping and returned to the boarding house without incident. But the three men maintained their surveillance from various positions around the neighborhood. That evening, Frank approached the boarding house directly, reasoning that Elena needed to be warned about the danger she faced, regardless of how his presence might complicate her life. He knocked on the front door and asked the young woman who answered if he could speak with Rosa Martinez on urgent business. The woman studied Frank with the careful assessment that came from experience with men who meant trouble, then asked him to wait while she consulted with Rosa. Frank stood on the front porch for 10 minutes, listening to muffled conversation from inside the building. Before the door opened again, Elena stood before him, 25 years older, but unmistakably herself. Her dark eyes wide with shock and recognition, and something that might have been relief. "Frank," she whispered.
Frank Delaney?
"Hello, Elena, we need to talk." She stepped onto the porch and closed the door behind her, studying his face in the gaslight as if confirming his reality. "How did you find me? After all these years, how did you know where to look?" "Your diary, hidden in the well where we used to meet. Sadie led me to it, somehow knew it was there." Elena's hand flew to her throat, searching for a locket that was no longer there. "You found my diary? Then you know about our child, about why you had to disappear. About Jim Cortez and the Broken Arrow gang." Frank stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Elena, you're in danger. There are men watching your boarding house. Men who weren't here a week ago. Professional killers from the look of them." Elena's face paled. "After all these years? But Jim Cortez is dead, the gang was scattered. Who would still care about what happened in Silver Creek? Sons of gang members. Men who blame you for their fathers' deaths or imprisonment. Revenge doesn't have a statute of limitations, Elena. These men found you somehow, and they're planning something." Elena looked up and down the street, her expression shifting from reunion joy to the wariness that had once saved her life in New Mexico. "How many men?" "3 that I've seen, probably more. They're conducting surveillance, learning your routines. Classic preparation for an assault." Elena straightened her shoulders, and Frank saw the courage that had enabled her to fake her own death and build a new life from nothing. "Then we need to get the other women to safety. This boarding house is sanctuary for women who've already escaped from violence once. I won't let them be hurt because of my past. Elena, these aren't men you can negotiate with or scare away. They've traveled a long way to find you, probably spent considerable money tracking you down. They mean to finish what the Broken Arrow gang started 25 years ago. Then we'll have to stop them," Elena said simply. "Together if you're willing. I won't run away again, Frank. I've built something important here, protected women who had nowhere else to turn. If violent men want to destroy that, they'll have to go through me to do it." Frank looked at the woman he'd loved for 25 years, seeing in her face the same determination that had once led her to stand up to corrupt lawmen and murderous outlaws. Elena Vasquez had died in 1868, but Rosa Martinez had inherited her courage along with her memories. "I'm willing," Frank said. "I've spent 25 years wishing I'd been here to protect you the first time. I won't make that mistake again. Elena smiled for the first time since recognizing him, the expression transforming her face into something that bridged the decades between their separation and reunion. Then come inside, Frank Delaney. We have a lot to discuss and not much time to discuss it. And I want you to meet your daughter. Inside Casa Rosa, Frank's reunion with Elena unfolded in the boarding house's modest parlor, surrounded by evidence of the life she'd built from courage and determination. Photographs of the women she'd helped lined the walls, testimonials to lives salvaged and futures reclaimed. The room smelled of fresh bread and coffee, the sense of home and sanctuary that Elena had created for herself and others. "Maria!" Elena called toward the kitchen. "Come meet someone." A young woman entered the parlor, and Frank's breath caught in his throat. She was unmistakably his daughter, 24 years old, with Elena's grace and his own stubborn chin, her dark hair twisted into a practical bun. But it was her eyes that confirmed the relationship, grey-green like Frank's own, holding intelligence and strength that spoke to her heritage from both parents. "This is my daughter, Maria Martinez," Elena said softly. "Maria, this is Frank Delaney. Your father." Maria studied Frank with frank curiosity, showing none of the shock or confusion he'd expected. "Mother's told me about you my entire life. She said you were the bravest and most honest man she'd ever known, and that someday you might find us when it was safe to do so." Frank struggled for words, overwhelmed by the reality of meeting a daughter he'd never known existed. "Maria, you're beautiful like your mother. I'm sorry I wasn't here to watch you grow up." "You couldn't have been," Maria said simply. Mother explained about the danger, about why she had to disappear. She made the right choice, even though it was hard for everyone. Elena moved to Frank's side, and he noticed she wore a simple gold band on her wedding finger, despite never having remarried. The ring was one he recognized, the engagement ring he'd bought 25 years ago, carried in his vest pocket while planning a proposal that had never come. "You found it," Frank said, touching her hand gently, "in your room at the marshal's office, after you'd given up searching for me. Jim Cortez returned your personal effects to me as next of kin, not knowing who I really was. I've worn it all these years, waiting for the day we could finish the conversation we started in New Mexico." Frank took Elena's hands in his, feeling the years collapse between them. She was older, he was older. They were different people, shaped by decades of separate experiences. But the connection that had drawn them together in Silver Creek remained unchanged, strengthened rather than weakened by time and separation. "We need to talk about the men watching the boarding house," Frank said reluctantly, duty overriding romance. "They're not going to wait much longer to make their move." Elena nodded, her expression shifting to the practical focus that had enabled her survival. "How many women are staying here now?" she asked Maria. 12, plus Mrs. Chen and her 2 children. "Most are recent arrivals, still recovering from whatever they escaped. None of them are prepared for violence. We need to get them to safety," Elena said. "The church has rooms where they can stay temporarily, and Father Miguel will ask no questions about why they need sanctuary." Frank studied the boarding house's layout, his martial experience automatically assessing defensive positions and escape routes. "This is a good building for defense. Stone construction, limited access points, clear sightlines. But you're right about getting the innocent people out first. I'll coordinate the evacuation," Maria said. "Most of the women trust me, and I know safe places where they can wait until this is resolved." Elena looked at Frank with an expression that bridged past and present. The woman who'd loved him and the woman who'd survived without him. "What's your plan?" "Simple and direct. We make it clear that you're not running anymore, that anyone who wants to hurt you will have to deal with me first. Sometimes the best defense is making yourself too dangerous to attack casually. These aren't casual men, Frank. If they've tracked me down after 25 years, they're serious about finishing old business. Then we'll have to be more serious than they are." Frank moved to the window, studying the street outside. "How well do you know this neighborhood? Are there people who would help if we asked?" "Better than that. There's a network here, Frank. Women who've survived violence, men who've learned to respect the strength that survival requires. This boarding house isn't just my work, it's a community effort. Elena moved beside him at the window, and Frank caught the scent of her hair, unchanged despite the years. We protected each other in Silver Creek for 3 months. We can protect each other here for whatever time it takes. The odds are different now, Frank warned. We're not young anymore, and we're facing professionals rather than opportunistic criminals, Elena smiled, and Frank saw in her expression the same quiet confidence that had first attracted him decades earlier. The odds have always been against us, Frank. That's never stopped us before. Maria returned from coordinating the evacuation, her efficiency reminding Frank of Elena's ability to organize complex tasks under pressure. The other women are leaving quietly through the back entrance. Father Miguel is expecting them at the church. Mrs. Chen wanted to stay and help, but I convinced her that protecting her children was more important. Good work, Eleanor said. Now we need to prepare for whatever comes next. Frank walked through the boarding house, noting its strengths and vulnerabilities. The building was solidly constructed, with thick walls and secure doors. The upper floors provided good observation points, and the basement offered shelter if retreat became necessary. More importantly, Frank could see that Elena had chosen her location well. Casa Rosa occupied a corner position that limited approach angles, and the surrounding buildings housed people who clearly respected and protected Elena's work. There's something else you should know, Elena said as they completed their inspection. I'm not the same woman who needed protection in Silver Creek. 25 years of helping women escape from violent situations has taught me things about survival that I didn't know when I was younger. She opened a cabinet in her office and revealed a small arsenal, handguns, rifles and ammunition, all well maintained and obviously familiar to their owner. Running a sanctuary for threatened women means being prepared for the threats that follow them. Frank felt a surge of admiration for the woman Elena had become. She'd not just survived their separation, she'd grown stronger, had learned skills that complemented the courage that had always defined her character. In that case, Frank said, checking the loads in one of Elena's rifles, we might just surprise the men who think they're hunting easy prey. Outside, darkness was falling over San Francisco, bringing with it the confrontation that would determine whether Frank and Elena could finally build the future they'd been denied 25 years earlier. The hunt was almost over. One way or another, the attack came at midnight, exactly as Frank had predicted, based on 30 years of experience with men who lived by violence. 3 figures approached Casa Rosa from different directions, their movements coordinated and professional, confirming Frank's assessment that these weren't common criminals but experienced killers. Frank watched from an upper-floor window as the leader, a tall man with the bearing of someone accustomed to command, positioned himself across the street, while his companions flanked the building. The tactical approach was sound, designed to prevent escape and maximize their advantages. Jeremiah Rourke, Elena said from beside him, recognition in her voice. I should have known. You know him? Son of Patrick Rourke, one of the Broken Arrow gang members your people captured in '69. Patrick died in territorial prison 5 years later, but not before filling his son's head with stories about the cantina woman who destroyed his father's life. Frank studied Rourke through the window, noting the family resemblance to the wanted poster he'd seen decades earlier. He's carried that grudge for 25 years. Some people need something to hate, Elena said simply. It gives them purpose when they can't find it any other way. Frank reached into his travel bag and withdrew something he'd carried for 2 years of retirement. His marshal's star, tarnished but serviceable. He pinned it to his vest with steady fingers, feeling the familiar weight that represented duty and authority and the promise to protect innocent people from those who would harm them. One more time, Frank murmured. Elena touched the star gently. It suits you better than I remembered. The first assault came through the front door, Rourke's men attempting to breach the entrance with coordinated force. But Frank had expected this approach. had barricaded the door and prepared defensive positions that turned the attackers' strength against them. Frank's rifle spoke from the second-floor window, and one of Rourke's men stumbled backward, clutching his shoulder. Elena fired from a different window, her shot precise enough to shatter the streetlight and plunge their attackers into darkness. "You should have stayed buried, Elena Vasquez." Rourke's voice carried clearly in the night air. "My father died because of you, spent his last years in a cage because you couldn't mind your own business. Your father died because he was a murderer and a thief." Elena called back, "I just made sure justice found him." The gunfight intensified as Rourke's surviving men found cover and returned fire. Windows shattered and bullets splintered wood. But Frank and Elena held the high ground and the advantage of prepared positions. Frank moved through the boarding house with practiced efficiency, using different windows to deny his attackers fixed targets. His marksmanship, rusty from retirement but still functional, forced Rourke's men to keep their heads down and limited their ability to coordinate attacks. The decisive moment came when Rourke himself attempted to breach the building's rear entrance, probably expecting to find it less well defended. Frank was waiting, positioned where he could cover the back door, while Elena maintained oversight of the street. Rourke burst through the door with desperate aggression, his revolver already firing as he entered. But Frank's position gave him clear advantage, and his response was swift and final. Rourke stumbled and fell, his weapon clattering across the floor. "It's over," Frank called to the surviving attackers. "Your leader's down, you're outnumbered, and the San Francisco police are probably already responding to the gunfire. Time to cut your losses and ride away." The remaining men apparently agreed with Frank's assessment. Within minutes, the sounds of retreating horses indicated that Rourke's survivors had decided their dead employer's grudge wasn't worth dying for. Frank knelt beside Rourke, checking for signs of life and finding none. The man had carried his hatred for 25 years, had traveled hundreds of miles to exact revenge for his father's crimes, and had died in a strange city for the sake of grievances that should have been buried decades earlier. "Some people can't let go of the past," Elena said, looking down at Rourke's body. "Some people use the past to build better futures," Frank replied, standing and holstering his weapon. "We just proved which approach works better." The San Francisco police arrived within the hour, summoned by neighbors who'd grown tired of gunfire disturbing their sleep. Frank's martial star carried enough authority to satisfy their initial questions. Though he knew there would be more extensive inquiries in the morning, Elena walked through Casa Rosa, assessing damage and checking that their defensive preparations had protected the building's structural integrity. The boarding house could be repaired, the windows replaced, the bullet holes patched. More importantly, none of the innocent people who'd found sanctuary here had been hurt. "It's finished," Elena said, as they stood together in the damaged parlor. 25 years of looking over my shoulder, wondering when the past would catch up with me. Now I know." Frank removed his martial star and looked at it in the lamplight, considering whether he'd need it again. "Some cases take longer to close than others." "What happens now, Frank? We're not the same people we were in Silver Creek. We've both built lives that didn't include each other." Frank took Elena's hands in his, feeling the calluses that spoke of hard work and the strength that had enabled her survival. "Then maybe it's time to build a life that includes both of us." Outside, San Francisco continued its restless existence, a city where people came to start over and find new possibilities. Frank Delaney and Elena Vasquez, now Rosa Martinez, had finally found each other again. Older and scarred, but still alive, still capable of love, still ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring. Together, 6 months later, Frank knelt beside the new well he was digging behind Casa Rosa, his hand steady on the shovel handle despite the arthritis that reminded him daily of his 62 years. The work was hard but satisfying, each foot of progress bringing clean water closer to the surface. Each stone positioned with the care of a man who understood that some things were built to last. Elena emerged from the boarding house carrying a pitcher of lemonade, her hair now shorter and styled in the practical fashion of a woman who'd found her place in the world. She wore a simple blue dress and the gold ring that had finally found its proper purpose after waiting 25 years to seal promises that had been interrupted by violence and fear. The city inspector says you're digging the finest well in the Mission District, Elena said, settling onto a wooden crate beside Frank's worksite. He's never seen stonework like yours. Learned from the old-timers in New Mexico, Frank replied, accepting the lemonade gratefully. They knew how to build things that would last through whatever weather came along. Frank and Elena had married on a quiet Tuesday morning in March, surrounded by the women of Casa Rosa and witnessed by Father Miguel, who'd asked no questions about their complicated history, but had blessed their union with genuine warmth. The ceremony was simple, the vows spoken with the understanding that came from love, tested by time and separation, and found worthy of preservation. Their wedding night had been spent in Elena's modest room at the boarding house, talking until dawn about the years they'd lost and the years they hoped to gain. They were different people than they'd been in Silver Creek, older, scarred by experience, shaped by decades of separate struggles, but the connection that had drawn them together remained unchanged, strengthened rather than weakened by the trials they'd endured. Frank had sold his New Mexico homestead to Miguel Santos, who'd promised to care for Sadie until her natural end, and to maintain the stone well where Eleanor's secrets had waited for discovery. In his final letter, Miguel reported that Sadie had taken to drinking from the old well again, as if her long vigil was finally complete. In San Francisco, Frank had found new purpose in work that felt like a natural extension of his years in law enforcement. Casa Rosa served women who'd escaped from abusive situations, and many of them needed protection that went beyond locked doors and kind words. Frank's experience and instincts, combined with Elena's network of supporters, had created a sanctuary that was both safe and practical. "Mrs. Chen wants to name her new baby after you," Elena said, watching Frank position stones around the well's rim. "Little Frank Chen, if it's a boy. She says you saved her life when her husband tracked her down last month." Frank nodded, remembering the confrontation that had required all his old skills and several new ones. Mrs. Chen's husband had been violent and determined, but he'd also been unprepared to face a retired marshal who'd spent decades dealing with men who believed they owned the women in their lives. "She saved herself," Frank said. "I just made sure she had the chance to do it safely." The new well was Frank's gift to Casa Rosa, but it was also his statement about their future together. The old well in New Mexico had held secrets and sorrow, evidence of love interrupted by violence and fear. This well would provide life-giving water, would serve women and children who needed fresh starts and new possibilities. Frank had positioned it carefully, where the morning sun would warm the stone rim and the evening light would make the water sparkle like liquid gold. Elena had suggested the location, understanding without words that Frank needed to build something that represented hope rather than heartbreak. Maria Martinez, Frank, still marveled at having a daughter, had adapted to his presence with remarkable grace, treating him like the father she'd always known she had, but never expected to meet. She'd inherited Elena's strength and Frank's stubbornness, a combination that made her formidable in defending the boarding house's residents and efficient in managing its daily operations. "Maria's been accepted to the Teachers' College," Elena said, pride evident in her voice. "She wants to work with immigrant children, help them learn English and adapt to American schools." Frank felt a surge of paternal pride at this news. Despite having played no role in Maria's upbringing, Elena had raised their daughter to be independent and compassionate, qualities that would serve her well in work that mattered. "She'll be good at it," Frank said. "She's got her mother's gift for helping people find their strength." Evening was approaching, painting San Francisco's sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded Frank of New Mexico sunsets. But this was home now, this city of hills and fog and second chances. This place, where Frank Delaney and Elena Vasquez could finally build the life they'd dreamed of in Silver Creek's cantina. The well was nearly finished, its stone walls solid and true, its depth sufficient to reach the sweet water that flowed beneath San Francisco's bustling surface. Tomorrow, Frank would install the pump and cover, would test the water quality, and ensure that everything functioned as intended. But tonight, he sat beside Elena in the gathering darkness, listening to the sounds of women and children settling into sleep behind the safe. Walls of Casa Rosa, the boarding house was full. Again, 12 women and 7 children who'd found sanctuary from violence and fear, who were learning to trust in the possibility of better tomorrows. Do you ever regret it? Elena asked quietly. Giving up your peaceful retirement for this complicated life? Frank considered the question seriously, as he considered all of Elena's questions. The past 6 months had been anything but peaceful. There had been confrontations with abusive husbands, negotiations with suspicious landlords, and the constant vigilance required to protect vulnerable people from those who would exploit their desperation. But there had also been moments of profound satisfaction, watching frightened women rediscover their courage, seeing children laugh without fear, knowing that his experience and Elena's wisdom were creating something that mattered more than individual comfort or security. Peace isn't the absence of conflict, Frank said finally. It's knowing you're fighting for things worth protecting. I've got that here with you, Elena. I've got more than I ever dared hope for. Elena leaned against his shoulder, fitting into the curve of his arm, as if the 25 years of separation had been merely a long afternoon rather than half a lifetime. Above them, stars appeared in San Francisco's clear sky, the same stars that had witnessed their first meetings in Silver Creek, their separation and survival, their improbable reunion and hard-won happiness. The new well caught starlight on its surface, promising fresh water for thirsty souls, life-giving hope for women and children who traveled long distances to find safety. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new people in need of protection, new reasons to be grateful for the chance to serve something larger than themselves. But tonight was for quiet satisfaction, for the peace that came from meaningful work and enduring love, for the understanding that some stories took decades to reach. Their proper endings, but were worth the wait. When they finally did, Frank Delaney had spent most of his adult life chasing justice across territories where law was more hope than reality. Now beside a well that would serve future generations, and a woman whose love had survived everything the world could throw against it, he'd finally found the justice that mattered most, the justice of second chances, of love that endured, of wells that gave life instead of hiding death, the justice of coming home.